No declaration announced it, no leader planned it, and yet, by 1775, peace was already impossible. What exists at this moment is not drama, but pressure, political, economic, psychological, compressing slowly enough that most people living inside it mistake endurance for stability. British North America continues to function on the surface. Courts open, ships unload cargo, sermons are preached, trade routes operate with familiar rhythms. Yet, beneath that routine, assumptions that once held the empire together have already begun to fail, quietly and irreversibly. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Invite viewers to post their location and local time. What has changed is not law in a formal sense, nor allegiance in an official one. What has changed is expectation. Britain expects obedience to follow victory. The colonies expect recognition to follow contribution. These expectations coexist for a time without collision, only because neither side tests the limits too aggressively. Yet, after the 7 Years' War, Britain emerges as the dominant imperial power in North America. France is pushed out of Canada. Spanish influence is constrained. From London's perspective, this triumph is expensive but necessary. And the empire must now be administered more efficiently, more rationally, more profitably. Debt is real. Defense costs are real. Authority, Parliament insists, must finally match responsibility. Across the Atlantic, the same victory produces a different internal reckoning. Colonists have supplied militias, provisions, labor, and local leadership. Many fought alongside British regulars. Others defended their own frontiers with minimal imperial assistance. The war did not feel like distant policy to them. It felt like lived experience, sacrifice, and survival. Prosperity follows, but so does confidence, and confidence rarely remains content with inherited limitations. This is where inevitability begins to form, not through confrontation, but through incompatible conclusions drawn from the same events. Britain concludes that tighter control is justified. The colonies conclude that autonomy has already been earned. Neither conclusion is irrational within its own framework. Together, they create friction that cannot be resolved without one side abandoning its self-understanding. An important historiographic question emerges here and remains unresolved. Did imperial authority harden because London feared losing control, or because it genuinely believed reform would stabilize the empire? Evidence supports both interpretations. Parliamentary debates reveal concern over precedent. If colonies resist taxation successfully, what stops others from doing the same? At the same time, correspondence shows sincere belief that colonial resistance is temporary noise, not principled opposition. Colonial leaders, for their part, do not initially speak of independence. They speak of rights, specifically, rights they believe already exist under English law. Representation, consent, local governance. These are not revolutionary demands in their minds, but conservative ones. The tension arises because Britain increasingly treats these claims as negotiable privileges rather than inherent protections. Daily life absorbs this tension unevenly. Merchants feel it first, in regulations and duties that complicate trade. Printers feel it next, as political pamphlets circulate faster than official proclamations. Ordinary townspeople feel it gradually, as debates once confined to assemblies spill into taverns, churches, and private homes. political disagreement stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. Imperial calm persists, but it is no longer trusted. British officials interpret the absence of rebellion as compliance. Colonists interpret restraint as strategic patience. This mutual misreading is critical. It allows each side to believe time is on its side, when in reality, time is narrowing available outcomes. Fear operates quietly beneath the rhetoric. British leaders fear disorder more than injustice. They have seen empires fracture before. Colonial leaders fear precedent more than punishment. They understand that surrendering once may foreclose resistance forever. Each decision, therefore, becomes weighted beyond its immediate context, interpreted as a signal of future intentions. Historians still debate whether a decisive compromise was possible at this stage. Some argue that meaningful colonial representation in Parliament might have preserved unity. Others suggest that distance, scale, and economic divergence had already made such solutions impractical. What is clear is that neither side fully grasps how transformed the relationship has become. Britain governs as if authority is intact. The colonies respond as if it is already conditional. Language reflects the shift before violence does. Words like liberty, power, corruption, and obedience appear more frequently and with sharper edges. These terms no longer describe theory. They describe lived experience. When vocabulary changes, behavior often follows. Nothing irreversible has yet occurred in a legal sense. No shots have been fired. No independence declared. But psychologically, a threshold has been crossed. Trust, the assumption that disagreement will ultimately resolve within shared rules, has begun to erode. Once that erosion starts, every action is reinterpreted through suspicion rather than goodwill. This is the first condition of inevitability, not rebellion, but the collapse of shared interpretation. When the same action means responsibility to one side and oppression to the other, reconciliation becomes increasingly improbable. The empire still exists on paper. Loyalty is still spoken aloud. But the foundation that made those concepts functional is already cracking. Hold on to this moment. Remember that. The surface calm, the internal strain, because everything that follows grows out of this phase, not from sudden radicalism, but from gradual misalignment. By the time conflict becomes visible, the underlying break will already be complete. The war that had just ended was supposed to simplify everything. Britain stood victorious. Its enemies pushed back. Its empire larger than ever before. On maps in London, the result looked clean and decisive. New borders drawn, old threats erased. The North American continent reorganized under a single imperial logic. What those maps did not show was cost, and what they concealed even more carefully was consequence. The 7 Years' War had drained Britain's treasury at a scale few civilians fully grasped. Debt ballooned. Interest alone consumed alarming portions of state revenue. The victory that confirmed Britain's global dominance also locked it into a permanent problem. How to pay for an empire that now required constant defense across oceans and frontiers. From Parliament's point of view, the answer appeared obvious. The colonies had benefited from the war. The colonies were safer. The colonies should help pay. This reasoning did not feel punitive in London. It felt administrative. Britain already taxed its own population heavily. Customs, excise duties, land taxes. These were normal tools of governance. Extending similar logic across the Atlantic seemed not only fair, but overdue. The empire had outgrown informal oversight. Victory demanded structure. In North America, the same war had produced a different psychological result. French power had long functioned as a restraining force. Its removal altered how colonists viewed both security and necessity. Without a powerful enemy to the north and west, British military protection felt less urgent. Local militias had proven effective. Frontier communities had survived through their own coordination. Dependence on imperial troops no longer felt self-evident. This shift matters because empires rely as much on perception as on force. Britain still possessed overwhelming military power, but power unused must be justified rhetorically to remain legitimate. When protection is no longer clearly needed, authority must rest on consent or habit. In the colonies, habit was weakening, and consent had never been clearly defined. Parliamentary debates during this period reveal an important contradiction. Lawmakers spoke of colonial loyalty while simultaneously expressing deep suspicion of colonial motives. They assumed resistance was opportunistic rather than principled. Complaints were interpreted as attempts to avoid responsibility rather than defend rights. That assumption hardened policy, narrowing the range of responses Britain considered acceptable. At the same time, many in London genuinely believed they were acting moderately. The proposed taxes were small compared to those borne by British citizens at home. Officials saw colonial outrage as exaggerated, even theatrical. This miscalculation would echo repeatedly. Britain judged severity by economic burden. The colonies judged it by political precedent. Colonial leaders watched these developments closely, and not without concern. They understood debt, they understood administration, but they also understood something Parliament did not fully appreciate. That political legitimacy in the colonies flowed outward from local institutions, not downward from distant ones. Assemblies had long handled taxation internally. The idea that revenue could be imposed externally, without local consent, touched a nerve that went far deeper than money. Historians continue to debate whether this moment represents a true turning point or merely a missed opportunity. Some argue that if Britain had integrated colonial representatives into imperial decision-making earlier, the post-war reforms might have been accepted. Others suggest the scale of the empire and the speed of communication made such integration impractical. What is less disputed is that neither side seriously explored structural reform at this stage. Each tried to solve a relational problem with procedural fixes. Meanwhile, everyday colonial life adjusted almost imperceptibly. Veterans returned to farms and workshops. Trade resumed along familiar routes. Ports buzzed with renewed activity. Prosperity masked tension. It was possible, even easy, to believe that disagreements would resolve themselves as they always had. That belief allowed delay, and delay allowed misunderstanding to deepen. What Britain saw as consolidation, the colonies began to experience as intrusion. What Parliament framed as fairness, colonial pamphleteers framed as danger. Language sharpened accordingly. Arguments became less about specific policies and more about principles, authority, liberty, obligation. Once disputes reach that level, compromise becomes harder to sell because concession starts to look like surrender. Another unresolved question hangs over this period. Did Britain underestimate colonial political maturity, or did it consciously dismiss it? Evidence suggests elements of both. Some officials genuinely viewed the colonies as peripheral extensions, not partners. Others recognized colonial complexity, but believed firmness would prevent fragmentation. In either case, policy moved forward without recalibrating assumptions. This is where inevitability tightens its grip. Victory had removed external threats, but exposed internal ones. Britain now faced an empire that no longer fit the structures designed to manage it. The colonies faced a mother country that no longer governed with benign neglect, but with focused intent. Neither side paused long enough to ask whether the old relationship still made sense. By the late 1760s, the victory that once promised stability had quietly become a source of strain, and without any formal rupture, the aftermath of triumph began to feel like the prelude to something far less controlled. Prosperity does not announce political maturity, but it cultivates it all the same. By the mid-18th century, the American colonies had become something Britain had not fully intended and no longer clearly understood. Societies that functioned with confidence, complexity, and internal momentum. They were not merely extensions of the empire's economy. They were communities accustomed to solving their own problems, often without asking permission. Population growth alone altered the balance. Colonial cities expanded rapidly. Philadelphia, New York, Boston. Each became commercial hubs with newspapers, credit networks, and social hierarchies distinct from anything Parliament directly supervised. Wealth circulated locally. Decisions were made locally. Disputes were settled locally. The daily experience of governance, for most colonists, came not from distant statutes, but from familiar institutions they could see, influence, and, when necessary, challenge. This mattered because political authority feels different depending on how often it is encountered. In Britain, Parliament was a visible force. Taxes, regulations, and enforcement were part of everyday life. In the colonies, imperial authority had long been intermittent. For decades, Britain governed lightly, allowing colonial assemblies to handle most internal affairs. That absence of pressure did not produce gratitude, it produced habit. Self-direction became normal. Economic development reinforced that habit. Colonial merchants traded not only with Britain, but across the Atlantic world. Smuggling, officially illegal, was widely tolerated and quietly integrated into the economy. Local officials often participated. This created a blurred boundary between law and practice, where enforcement depended less on statute than on community consensus. When rules are selectively enforced for long enough, people stop experiencing them as absolute. Culturally, the colonies grew distinct without deliberately trying to. Distance slowed communication. News from London arrived weeks or months late. Local events filled the gap. Printers published essays and debates that assumed a politically engaged readership. Literacy rates climbed. Political discussion became a form of social participation rather than elite ritual. Ideas circulated horizontally, not vertically. British observers noticed these changes, but often misread them. Many interpreted colonial confidence as immaturity, noise from societies not yet disciplined by history. Others saw it as ingratitude. Very few recognized it as adulthood. Empires are good at managing dependence. They are far less comfortable managing equals. Colonial leaders themselves did not agree on what this maturity meant. Some still imagined a future firmly within the empire, but on revised terms. Others sensed that the old structure could not stretch much further without tearing. These disagreements unfolded quietly in correspondence and pamphlets long before they appeared in public declarations. What united them was a shared assumption that local political life mattered more than distant authority. Here lies another historical puzzle. Did the colonies intend to redefine their place within the empire, or were they already drifting beyond it without fully acknowledging the direction? The evidence suggests intention and drift operating simultaneously. Leaders argued for rights within the imperial framework, even as their daily practices moved outside it. The contradiction was sustainable only as long as Britain tolerated ambiguity. Ambiguity, however, is expensive for centralized power. From London's perspective, unclear authority invited disorder. If colonies governed themselves too freely, where did imperial sovereignty actually reside? That question became harder to ignore as colonial populations grew and economic stakes increased. The more capable the colonies became, the more threatening their autonomy appeared. Yet for colonists, this capability felt earned rather than granted. They had built towns, defended borders, created institutions, and cultivated prosperity across generations. Authority that arrived late, demanding recognition without relationship, felt artificial. It was not simply unwelcome, it was unfamiliar. This mismatch in political experience widened quietly. Britain saw colonies that required management. Colonists saw societies that had already learned to manage themselves. Neither view was entirely wrong, but they could not coexist indefinitely. As long as imperial oversight remained distant, the tension stayed latent. As oversight sharpened, the tension moved closer to the surface. By the early 1770s, the colonies no longer felt like dependents waiting to be guided. They felt like adults being corrected by someone who had not noticed they had grown up. That sensation did not yet demand separation, but it made submission increasingly difficult to justify, especially as new policies tested how far local autonomy truly extended. And so, without formal rupture or unified intent, the ground continued to shift, slowly enough that no single step felt decisive, yet steadily enough that turning back would soon require more effort than moving forward. Authority becomes brittle when it is asserted without being clearly explained. By the time Parliament turned its attention seriously toward colonial revenue, it was no longer legislating for distant dependence, but intervening in societies that had learned to interpret power on their own terms. The problem was not simply that taxes were proposed, but that the logic behind them assumed a political relationship the colonies no longer recognized in practice. In Britain, parliamentary supremacy was not a theoretical concept. It was lived reality. Parliament did not represent every citizen equally, but it represented the nation symbolically and legally. Consent in this system was indirect and uneven, yet widely accepted as legitimate. British lawmakers extended this reasoning outward, assuming that representation of the empire could function the same way it did at home. The colonies, they argued, were virtually represented by Parliament's concern for imperial welfare. In North America, this argument landed badly. Colonial assemblies had operated for decades on a different premise. Taxation followed local consent, and consent required proximity. Representation meant knowing the people affected, hearing grievances directly, and facing consequences in the same community. Virtual representation sounded less like theory and more like abstraction, a word that justified decisions without accountability. This was not merely a philosophical disagreement, it was a practical one. When laws were made far away, delayed in arrival, and enforced unevenly, colonists experienced them less as governance and more as intrusion. Parliament viewed authority as indivisible. The colonies experienced it as conditional, shaped by custom and long-standing practice rather than statute alone. The Stamp Act crystallized this difference. For Parliament, it was an efficient internal tax, familiar and administratively sensible. For colonists, it reached into daily transactions, newspapers, legal documents, licenses, touching the mechanisms of communication and law itself. The burden was not crushing in financial terms, but it was intimate. It announced that Parliament could insert itself directly into colonial life without asking. Resistance followed quickly, not because colonists rejected all taxation, but because they rejected the precedent. If Parliament could tax paper, it could tax anything. If consent was not required now, it might never be required again. This reasoning spread faster than official explanations could counter it. Once people begin to argue from principle rather than policy, numbers lose their calming effect. British officials underestimated this shift. They assumed protests were fueled by agitators rather than genuine concern. Repeal, they believed, would restore order without changing the underlying framework. But even repeal carried a contradiction. It removed the tax while reaffirming Parliament's right to impose it. Britain retreated tactically while advancing strategically, and the colonies noticed. Another unresolved historical question lingers here. Was Parliament testing limits deliberately, or simply acting within its own political habits, unaware that those habits no longer translated across the Atlantic? The record suggests no grand plan, only momentum. Once authority is asserted, withdrawing it entirely becomes politically dangerous. Each step was justified by the one before it. In the colonies, political awareness sharpened. Resistance was no longer reactive. It became organized. Committees formed. Correspondence networks expanded. Arguments grew more disciplined. What had begun as outrage over a specific law evolved into a broader interrogation of power. Who had the right to govern, and on what terms? Those questions did not yet demand separation, but they refused to be silenced. Daily life absorbed this tension unevenly. Some merchants suffered, others adapted. Ordinary people learned the language of protest alongside the routines of work. Politics became something discussed openly, even casually, as if governance itself had moved closer to home. That closeness made external authority feel increasingly remote. By insisting on authority without fully reconciling consent, Parliament hardened positions on both sides. Britain could no longer retreat without appearing weak. The colonies could no longer comply without appearing to abandon principles they had only recently learned to articulate. What remained was a narrowing corridor in which each action reduced the range of acceptable responses. Nothing irreversible had yet occurred, but the ground rules had changed. Authority was no longer assumed. It was debated. Consent was no longer implicit. It was demanded. And once those conversations begin, they rarely end quietly, especially when neither side agrees on who has the right to end them. Paper seems harmless until authority insists on touching it. When Parliament chose stamped paper as its instrument, it did not merely select a revenue stream. It placed imperial power directly into the hands of ordinary colonial life. Newspapers, contracts, court filings, licenses, objects people handled every day, now carried visible proof that Parliament could reach into transactions that once belonged entirely to local control. From London's perspective, the Stamp Act was almost modest. It required no new bureaucracy, relied on familiar administrative models, and promised predictable income. Officials viewed it as a technical solution to a technical problem. Debt needed servicing. Defense needed funding. Paper, unlike land or trade, could be regulated cleanly. Nothing about the policy felt radical inside Parliament. In the colonies, reaction unfolded along a different logic. The tax itself was irritating, but irritation alone does not produce mass resistance. What mattered was symbolism. Paper carried words, and words carried ideas. Stamping them with imperial authority felt like stamping thought itself. Printers, lawyers, merchants, those who shaped public communication, felt targeted first, and they understood what that implied. Protests emerged quickly, often improvised, sometimes theatrical. Effigies appeared in town squares. Crowds gathered, not yet violent, but increasingly confident. The streets became political spaces, places where opposition could be seen, heard, and counted. This visibility mattered. It transformed dissent from private grievance into shared experience. British officials misread these crowds. They interpreted disorder where colonists saw participation. Riots, from London's viewpoint, signaled lawlessness requiring discipline. From the colonial side, they signaled that political energy had moved beyond assemblies into the public sphere. Authority was no longer negotiated only among elites. It was being contested by communities. Another historical ambiguity persists here. Were colonial leaders directing popular resistance or struggling to keep pace with it? Evidence suggests both. Influential figures articulated arguments and coordinated responses, but crowds often acted faster than leaders could guide them. This dynamic unsettled everyone. Britain feared chaos. Colonial elites feared losing control of the movement they had helped awaken. The Stamp Act Congress attempted restraint, framing objections respectfully, emphasizing loyalty even as it questioned legality. Yet, parallel to these formal gestures, informal pressure intensified. Stamp distributors resigned under threat or intimidation. Paper went unstamped, not because laws changed, but because enforcement collapsed socially. This was a critical development. Power had been neutralized not by force, but by refusal. When repeal came, celebrations erupted across the colonies. Bells rang. Toasts were raised. Many believed the crisis had passed, but beneath the relief lay a quieter realization. Resistance had worked. Parliament had retreated. Crowds had mattered. The lesson was not lost on either side. Parliament paired repeal with the Declaratory Act, asserting full authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. To British lawmakers, this restored principle without provoking unrest. To colonial readers, it sounded like a warning disguised as reassurance. The contradiction lingered unresolved. Power affirmed, practice constrained. From this point forward, resistance no longer felt hypothetical. It had precedent. People had seen authority challenged and survive. They had watched imperial policy bend under pressure. That knowledge altered calculations everywhere. Compliance became a choice rather than an assumption. And choice introduces uncertainty where obedience once felt automatic. Daily routines resumed. But they did so with altered awareness. Newspapers carried sharper commentary. Conversations grew bolder. Political memory extended beyond immediate grievances to accumulated experience. The empire still stood, intact on paper, yet something essential had shifted in how its authority was perceived. By turning paper into a battlefield, Parliament had revealed more than it intended. It had shown where power touched daily life, and colonists had learned that those touchpoints could be resisted collectively. That realization did not yet demand separation, but it made future assertions of authority far riskier, especially as the next test approached. Retreat can look like weakness even when it is intended as wisdom. After repeal, Britain expected gratitude and a return to normalcy. From London's perspective, the crisis had been diffused. The tax was gone, trade would recover, and order would reassert itself. What was missed was how deeply the episode had altered colonial expectations about power, and how uncertain imperial resolve now appeared from across the Atlantic. In Britain, repeal was politically costly. Parliament had bowed to pressure from merchants and colonial agitation, and many lawmakers were determined not to repeat the experience. The Declaratory Act was meant to draw a firm line beneath the concession, reaffirming sovereignty while stepping away from the immediate conflict. It was a statement aimed as much inward, toward domestic critics, as outward toward the colonies. Colonists read the same act differently. The removal of the Stamp Act felt like validation. The assertion of authority that accompanied it felt hollow. If Parliament truly possessed absolute power, why had it withdrawn? This contradiction did not dissolve with explanation. It lingered, shaping interpretation of every subsequent policy. Street politics did not disappear with repeal. They had proven effective, and effectiveness invites repetition. Committees, informal networks, and crowd action remained part of the political landscape, ready to be activated when needed. This normalization of popular pressure marked a significant change. Political participation was no longer confined to elections or assemblies. It lived in public response. At the same time, colonial leaders grew more confident in coordinating across provinces. Letters circulated. Shared language emerged. Resistance became less local and more continental in character. The idea that colonies could act together, without central direction, began to feel practical rather than theoretical. Britain's next measures were crafted with caution, yet they still reflected unresolved assumptions. The Townshend duties targeted imports rather than internal transactions, aiming to avoid the mistakes of the Stamp Act. Revenue would come from trade. Enforcement would be tightened. Officials believed this approach respected colonial sensitivities while maintaining authority. Once again, colonists interpreted the policy through precedent rather than intention. External taxes still bypassed colonial consent. Enforcement still expanded imperial presence. The distinction Parliament relied upon mattered little to people who had learned to evaluate actions by their implications rather than their labels. Resistance resumed, but with greater discipline. Boycotts replaced riots. Economic pressure became a tool. Merchants agreed to non-importation agreements. Consumers adjusted habits. Participation became a daily practice rather than a momentary outburst. This shift unsettled British officials, who had prepared for disorder, not organized restraint. Historians continue to debate whether this phase represented escalation or stabilization. Some argue that boycotts demonstrated maturity and opened space for compromise. Others suggest they hardened divisions by embedding opposition into routine behavior. What is clear is that each cycle of resistance and response reinforced mutual suspicion. British troops were stationed in colonial cities to support enforcement, particularly in Boston. Officials viewed this as precaution. Residents experienced it as occupation. Soldiers and civilians lived alongside one another, sharing streets but not assumptions. Minor incidents accumulated. Words were exchanged. Tensions settled into daily life. Neither side yet believed war was inevitable. British leaders still assumed firmness would restore compliance. Colonial leaders still spoke of reconciliation alongside resistance. But the rhythm of confrontation had changed. Policies were no longer evaluated in isolation. Each new measure was filtered through memory of the last. By this point, authority had become something contested in practice, not just theory. The empire still functioned, but its mechanisms creaked under strain. What remained unresolved was whether those mechanisms could still adapt, or whether adaptation itself had become a sign of decline. As the decade wore on, patience thinned quietly. Neither side made dramatic moves, yet neither could forget how close control and resistance had already come to collision, and how easily the next encounter might tip further than anyone intended. Crowds do not become political overnight. They learn by doing. By the late 1760s, colonial communities had accumulated experience of gathering, of pressuring, of watching authority respond. What began as spontaneous reaction matured into something more predictable, almost procedural. People now knew where to assemble, whom to target, how to signal unity without dissolving into chaos. Street politics, once a last resort, settled into the background as an accepted method of influence. This normalization unsettled British officials more than open defiance ever had. Riots could be condemned and dispersed. Organized public pressure, sustained over time, resisted simple solutions. When merchants coordinated boycotts and citizens adhered to them, enforcement became awkward. Soldiers could guard warehouses, but they could not compel purchases. Power met a boundary it was not designed to cross. In colonial towns, participation took many forms. Some joined committees, others attended meetings or signed agreements. Many did nothing dramatic at all, simply choosing not to buy certain goods, choosing to listen more carefully to political talk, choosing to interpret imperial policy through a shared lens of suspicion. Politics became ambient, woven into daily choice rather than confined to moments of crisis. This shift also altered leadership. Influential figures no longer controlled events so much as they responded to them. Crowds moved quickly, sometimes ahead of coordination. Leaders learned to frame and channel energy rather than ignite it. This dynamic created tension within colonial society itself, as elites balanced fear of disorder against fear of irrelevance. British authorities, watching from a distance or through the reports of anxious governors, struggled to classify what they were seeing. It did not look like rebellion. It did not look like obedience either. It looked like something in between. A population testing how far it could act collectively without triggering outright repression. The ambiguity made firm response risky. Another question continues to occupy historians. Did popular resistance radicalize colonial leaders, or did leaders radicalize the public? The evidence resists a single answer. Arguments circulated in print. Actions unfolded in streets. Each reinforced the other. Once public participation became habitual, stepping back from it felt less like moderation and more like retreat. At the same time, divisions deepened. Not everyone welcomed this new political culture. Many colonists preferred stability, trade, and order. Loyalist sentiment remained significant, especially in regions dependent on imperial connections. Families found themselves split not by ideology alone, but by economic ties, temperament, and tolerance for uncertainty. Political disagreement stopped being theoretical and began to shape relationships. British policy did not fully adjust to this reality. Officials still assumed that visible authority, troops, laws, proclamations, would outweigh informal pressure. What they underestimated was how legitimacy had shifted. Authority, without acceptance, now produced resistance rather than compliance. And resistance without coordination proved harder to suppress than expected. As street politics became routine, it quietly altered expectations about what was possible. People learned that action did not always require permission, that influence could flow upward as well as downward. This lesson did not yet point clearly toward independence, but it narrowed the space in which traditional authority could operate comfortably. By the early 1770s, the streets themselves had become a kind of classroom. Experience replaced theory. Participation replaced deference. The empire still spoke in laws and proclamations, but colonial communities were increasingly fluent in a different language, one learned through repetition rather than instruction, and once learned, not easily forgotten. When soldiers arrive in a city that has not asked for them, every ordinary interaction acquires an edge. Boston in the late 1760s did not become tense overnight. Tension seeped in gradually, settling into routines, glances, and unspoken calculations. Redcoats marched through streets built for merchants and dock workers, not garrisons. Their presence was meant to stabilize enforcement. Instead, it rearranged daily life in ways that made neutrality harder to sustain. British officials viewed the stationing of troops as practical. Customs officers required protection. Laws required backing. The city had a reputation for agitation, and visible force was supposed to discourage disorder. On paper, the decision followed established imperial logic. In practice, it placed armed authority into the intimate spaces of a civilian town, where authority had long been negotiated informally. For residents, the change was immediate. Soldiers competed for work during off-duty hours, undercutting wages. Taverns filled with uniforms. Arguments flared over minor slights. Who yielded space on a narrow street? Who spoke first? Who watched too closely? None of this required ideology. Proximity alone was enough. Misunderstanding compounded friction. Many soldiers were young, far from home, trained for discipline rather than diplomacy. Many Bostonians were politically alert, accustomed to debate and public expression. Each side interpreted the other's behavior through suspicion. A stare became a challenge. A joke became an insult. Authority and resentment learned to recognize each other by instinct. British commanders struggled with the optics. Troops were ordered to maintain restraint, yet restraint itself could be read as weakness. Any show of force risked confirming colonial fears of occupation. Any withdrawal risked emboldening resistance. The margin for error narrowed daily, not because anyone sought violence, but because the environment punished missteps. Colonial leaders found themselves in an uneasy position. They did not control the troops, yet they were blamed for provoking them. They did not command the crowds, yet they were expected to calm them. Their public statements balanced condemnation of disorder with criticism of military presence, a balance that satisfied almost no one completely. Another question lingers here. Was the deployment of troops a turning point, or merely a symptom? Some historians argue that militarization made conflict inevitable by placing force at the center of political disagreement. Others suggest violence could still have been avoided if restraint had held. What is clear is that once soldiers and civilians shared streets under conditions of mistrust, the cost of maintaining peace rose sharply. Everyday incidents accumulated. Fights broke out. Insults were traded. Snowballs were thrown. Each episode ended quickly, but memory preserved them carefully. Stories spread, altered slightly with each retelling. The city developed a shared sense that something was waiting to happen, even if no one could say what form it would take. Authority in Boston no longer felt distant or abstract. It wore red coats. It carried muskets. It stood guard over warehouses and courts. That visibility changed the emotional texture of resistance. Opposition now had a human face, and so did power. This made reconciliation harder because grievances attached themselves to people rather than policies. By the winter of 1770, Boston lived inside a paradox. The presence, meant to enforce order, had made calm feel fragile. Routine required effort. Silence required vigilance. Each day passed without violence felt less like normalcy and more like delay. The city did not know when tension would break, only that it could not remain suspended indefinitely. And so life continued under watchful eyes, with voices lowered and tempers shortened, as if everyone sensed that the next small incident would not remain small for long. When violence finally came, it arrived without clarity. No single command set it in motion. No plan guided its shape, and no one present could later agree on how it truly began. What mattered was not precision, but perception, because the deaths that followed became evidence for arguments already formed rather than facts to be weighed calmly. On a cold evening in March 1770, tension in Boston condensed into minutes. Soldiers stood guard. A crowd gathered. Words were exchanged, sharp enough to cut through the cold air. Snow and ice were thrown. Someone fell. Someone shouted. Someone fired. Then others did. The sequence remains contested, and that uncertainty has never been fully resolved. Even eyewitnesses, questioned later, contradicted one another. 5 colonists lay dead or dying. In military terms, the incident was minor. In political terms, it was explosive. Violence had crossed from threat into reality, and it did so in a public space, under watchful eyes, in a city already primed to interpret force as meaning. British authorities moved quickly to contain damage. Troops were withdrawn from the streets. Arrests were made. The decision to hold a public trial signaled an attempt at legality rather than intimidation. This mattered. It showed that Britain still believed order could be restored through institutions rather than repression. Colonial leaders responded just as carefully. They did not inflame crowds. They did not call for revenge. Instead, they framed the event as proof that standing armies and civilian life could not coexist safely. proof that authority imposed at the muzzle of a musket invited catastrophe. The word massacre appeared almost immediately, not as a description, but as an interpretation. Here lies one of the most enduring historiographic divides. Was this a tragic misunderstanding escalated by fear, or an inevitable outcome of militarized governance? Evidence supports elements of both. Soldiers testified that they feared for their lives. Civilians testified that they felt provoked and intimidated. Each account was shaped by position, memory, and expectation. What made the event powerful was not its scale, but its narrative flexibility. It could be presented as murder or misfortune, oppression or chaos. Prints circulated showing orderly citizens gunned down by disciplined ranks. British accounts emphasized disorderly mobs threatening isolated sentries. Once images replaced nuance, complexity did not stand a chance. Daily life in Boston paused, then resumed under a heavier atmosphere. Funerals became processions. Silence became symbolic. People watched one another more closely, measuring reactions. Neutrality grew uncomfortable. To say nothing now sounded like agreement with someone else's version of events. The incident also exposed something deeper. Both sides still believed legality mattered. The soldiers would be tried. Lawyers would argue. Evidence would be weighed. That shared commitment to process suggests that inevitability had not yet hardened into certainty. But it also meant that whatever verdict emerged would carry consequences far beyond the courtroom. In the weeks that followed, the memory of those shots traveled faster than official explanations. By the time Parliament debated the situation, colonial opinion had already absorbed its meaning. Violence no longer belonged to the realm of hypothetical risk. It had entered lived experience, and once that happens, future restraint feels less reliable. Nothing about that night resolved the underlying conflict. Instead, it reframed it. Power was no longer just unjust or inconvenient. It was dangerous. Resistance was no longer just principled. It was risky. Each side adjusted its calculations, not dramatically, but enough to make the next confrontation feel closer, more personal, and harder to diffuse. The streets of Boston returned to routine, but routine now carried memory. And memory has a way of reshaping expectation, especially when no one can quite agree on what truly happened or what it proved. Trials are meant to settle facts, but sometimes they only reveal how divided interpretation has already become. When the soldiers involved in the Boston shootings were brought before a court, both sides understood the stakes extended far beyond individual guilt. What was on trial was not only conduct, but credibility, of imperial authority, of colonial restraint, of the promise that law could still mediate political conflict. British officials insisted on due process, and in doing so, they made a calculated decision. A fair trial, they believed, would demonstrate moral legitimacy and undercut claims of tyranny. The withdrawal of most troops from Boston reinforced this message. Authority, they hoped, could still operate through institutions rather than force. Colonial leaders faced a parallel calculation. If the trial appeared rigged, outrage would follow. If it appeared fair, the result would still be dangerous. Acquittal might suggest that imperial justice excused violence. Conviction might provoke retaliation or unrest. Either outcome carried risk, and restraint became its own strategy. The decision to allow respected colonial lawyers to defend the soldiers was significant. It signaled confidence in legal procedure, but it also forced colonists to confront an uncomfortable reality. The rule of law they claimed to defend might protect those they opposed. This tension cut deep. Principles are easy to assert in abstraction. They are harder to uphold when they favor the other side. Testimony unfolded slowly. Witnesses contradicted one another. Memory blurred. Fear distorted recollection. Some described a threatening mob. Others described disciplined soldiers firing without cause. The court, faced with uncertainty, leaned toward caution. Most of the soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder and punished lightly. In legal terms, the outcome made sense. In political terms, it satisfied almost no one. British officials saw proof that justice functioned. Many colonists saw confirmation that imperial authority could harm without consequence. The verdict did not inflame the streets, but it settled uneasily into public consciousness. What followed was not immediate escalation, but quiet hardening. The trial removed urgency without removing grievance. It demonstrated that legality could coexist with resentment, that fairness in process did not guarantee acceptance of outcome. This realization mattered deeply because it suggested that future conflicts might survive institutional resolution intact. Historians still debate whether the trial represented a missed opportunity for reconciliation or an unavoidable disappointment. Some argue that it showed restraint on both sides and delayed further violence. Others suggest it merely postponed confrontation while deepening mistrust. Evidence supports both readings, depending on whether one measures success by absence of riot or presence of confidence. Outside Boston, the incident and its aftermath circulated as story fragments rather than transcripts. Prints, sermons, and conversations emphasized emotion over nuance. Distance simplified narrative. By the time the event reached other colonies, it had already been absorbed into a broader pattern of interpretation. Standing armies were dangerous, imperial justice unreliable, resistance necessary. Within Boston, life moved forward under altered assumptions. People spoke more carefully. Public gatherings felt heavier. Authority no longer appeared simply misguided. It appeared insulated. Colonial leaders adjusted rhetoric, emphasizing unity and vigilance rather than immediate action. The movement did not surge forward. It settled in, patient and watchful. This period of uneasy calm did not feel like resolution. It felt like waiting. Both sides had tested restraint and found it wanting. The trial had proven that institutions could function, but it had also proven that functioning was not the same as healing. Something essential, confidence that disagreement could be contained, had thinned further. As memory of the shooting blended with memory of the verdict, the lesson that lingered was not legal detail, but emotional residue. Violence had occurred. Justice had spoken. And yet, no shared understanding had emerged. That gap, quiet but persistent, would shape how the next confrontation was met. Less with hope for correction, more with expectation of disappointment. After public crisis comes a quieter phase, one that often proves more decisive than the moment of impact itself. The early 1770s did not feel revolutionary on the surface. There were fewer riots, fewer confrontations, fewer visible shocks. Yet beneath that apparent calm, ideas hardened, habits settled, and organizational muscles strengthened. The pause was deceptive because it allowed both sides to prepare without admitting that preparation was underway. Parliament adjusted course again. Most of the townshend duties were repealed, a tacit acknowledgement that pressure had limits. One tax remained. The duty on tea retained less for revenue than for principle. Authority, Parliament insisted, could not be surrendered entirely without undermining itself. The colonies noticed the symbolism immediately. A single tax was enough to keep the argument alive. In North America, attention shifted from protest to infrastructure. Committees of correspondence expanded, quietly linking towns and colonies into networks of information and coordination. Letters traveled faster than official directives. News was framed before governors could respond. This was not rebellion in form, but it was preparation in function, building the capacity to act together if needed. Colonial leaders refined language during this period. Rhetoric grew more disciplined, less reactive. Arguments were grounded in history, law, and precedent. Pamphlets circulated not to inflame crowds, but to educate them. Political participation matured into something resembling civic identity, where understanding events became as important as reacting to them. Britain, meanwhile, interpreted the lull as partial success. Reduced unrest suggested that firmness mixed with concession could restore order. Officials underestimated how much opposition had moved inward, away from streets and into planning. Silence was misread again, this time as fatigue rather than consolidation. Another historiographic question emerges here. Did the calm delay conflict or make it inevitable by allowing each side to entrench? Some historians argue that compromise still remained possible, that reduced tensions offered a chance for reset. Others suggest that the absence of open conflict simply removed urgency, allowing assumptions to harden without challenge. What is clear is that neither side used the pause to reimagine the relationship fundamentally. Everyday life continued, and that continuity mattered. Resistance did not feel like emergency anymore. It felt like normal awareness. People learned to live politically, to incorporate vigilance into routine. When politics becomes habitual rather than reactive, it no longer needs crisis to sustain it. Loyalty, too, settled into quieter forms. Many colonists remained attached to Britain, culturally and emotionally. They did not see themselves as revolutionaries, but loyalty now came with conditions. It was something to be negotiated, not assumed. That shift alone marked a profound change, even in the absence of violence. By the time the tea duty lingered as the sole remaining irritant, it carried weight far beyond its economic value. It stood as proof that Parliament had not abandoned its claim, and claims, once asserted and resisted, do not fade quietly. They wait. This interlude did not announce its importance, but it reshaped readiness on both sides. Britain believed time favored authority. The colonies discovered time favored coordination. When calm finally gave way again, it would not be because tempers suddenly flared, but because patience had been used to prepare for something no one any longer expected to avoid entirely. Tea was never just tea, but it took time for that to become obvious. By the early 1770s, the remaining duty sat quietly on the books, collecting little revenue and provoking little immediate outrage. That quiet was misleading. What the tax preserved was not income, but a principle Parliament refused to abandon: the right to tax the colonies without their consent. As long as that principle remained unchallenged in practice, authority could still be claimed intact. The East India Company's crisis changed the equation. Burdened by debt, mismanagement, and surplus stock, the company teetered on the edge of collapse. For Parliament, this was not merely a commercial problem. The company was an imperial instrument, deeply entangled with state power. Allowing it to fail would signal weakness. Saving it required action. The Tea Act of 1773 was designed as a solution elegant enough to appear harmless. By allowing the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing intermediaries, Parliament lowered the price of tea even with the tax included. Colonists, lawmakers believed, would choose cheaper tea over abstract principle. Consumption would legitimize authority quietly, without confrontation. In Britain, the plan seemed clever. In the colonies, it was read as a trap. Lower prices did not erase the tax. They normalized it. Accepting the tea meant accepting Parliament's right to tax. Not in theory, but in daily habit. That distinction mattered deeply to colonial leaders who had spent years framing resistance around precedent rather than hardship. Reaction spread unevenly but decisively. Ports debated how to respond. Some merchants refused to accept consignments. Some communities pressured agents to resign. Crowds gathered again, this time with purpose sharpened by experience. Resistance was no longer spontaneous. It was deliberate. Another unresolved question shadows this moment. Did Parliament anticipate resistance and proceed anyway? Or did it genuinely miscalculate colonial priorities? Evidence suggests a mixture of arrogance and desperation. Officials overestimated economic incentive and underestimated symbolic consequence. They assumed behavior would follow price. Colonists proved willing to pay more for tea, or go without, to avoid conceding principle. What made the Tea Act especially dangerous was its subtlety. It did not impose force openly. It invited compliance. That invitation demanded refusal if resistance was to mean anything at all. Colonists who had learned from earlier episodes recognized the stakes immediately. This was not about beverage or commerce. It was about whether authority could reassert itself quietly after years of challenge. Public meetings intensified. Pamphlets sharpened tone. The language of resistance grew more confident, less defensive. Where earlier protests had insisted on loyalty, responses to the Tea Act increasingly emphasized rights that no longer depended on imperial approval. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. British officials, watching events unfold, still believed escalation could be avoided. Troops were not deployed preemptively. Governors were instructed to maintain order but avoid provocation. There was confidence, perhaps hope, that colonial resistance would fragment, that practical convenience would outweigh abstract concern. Instead, coordination deepened. Colonies watched one another closely, learning from responses in other ports. Boston, already experienced in confrontation, moved toward a decision that would make ambiguity impossible. Once tea ships arrived, delay would no longer protect anyone from choosing sides. As crates sat unopened and deadlines approached, the situation compressed. Options narrowed. Accepting the tea meant surrendering a principle long defended. Rejecting it openly risked retaliation. Doing nothing became impossible. In that tightening space, a line was about to be crossed, not accidentally, but deliberately, by people who understood that some acts could not be undone. Disguise does not always signal secrecy. Sometimes it signals intent. On the night the tea was destroyed, there was little effort to hide what was happening, only to control how it would be interpreted. Costumes obscured individual identities, But the act itself unfolded in full view, deliberate, methodical, and unmistakably public. This was not riot behavior. It was choreography. When the tea ships sat in Boston Harbor, time itself became pressure. Deadlines approached. Customs regulations tightened options. Either the tea would be landed and the tax paid, or authority would be openly defied. Delay had worked before, but delay now functioned as consent by default. Doing nothing would allow Parliament's principle to stand. Action became the only way to refuse it. The destruction that followed was precise. Crates were opened. Tea was dumped. Nothing else was touched. Locks were replaced. Property unrelated to the tea remained intact. This discipline mattered. It communicated that the act targeted authority, not order. Violence was avoided not out of restraint alone, but to preserve meaning. British officials would later struggle with this clarity. If the act had been chaotic, it could be dismissed as lawlessness. If it had been secretive, it could be treated as criminal conspiracy. Instead, it occupied an uncomfortable space, illegal but controlled, destructive but principled, public but anonymous. It resisted easy classification. Colonial leaders understood the risk. This was not protest within the system. It was rejection of the system's claim to govern certain choices. The psychological line crossed here was not about property loss. It was about who decided what counted as legitimate authority. Once crossed, retreat became difficult to justify without redefining resistance itself. Another historical uncertainty surrounds intent. Did participants believe Britain would back down again? Or did they accept retaliation as likely? Evidence suggests awareness of consequence. Pamphlets and correspondence from the period reveal sober calculation rather than reckless optimism. This was not an impulsive act. It was undertaken by people who believed the alternative, quiet acceptance, was worse. Reaction in Boston was complex. Some celebrated. Others worried. Many understood immediately that the act changed the rules. What had been argument now looked like defiance. What had been negotiation now looked like challenge. The harbor returned to calm quickly, but that calm felt different, less like relief, more like aftermath. In Britain, news traveled slowly but landed heavily. The destruction was interpreted not as protest, but as insult, a direct attack on Parliament's authority and the East India Company's property. Sympathy for colonial grievances, already thin, eroded rapidly. Calls for firmness grew louder. The question shifted from how to reconcile to how to respond. What made reconciliation difficult was not the scale of damage, but the message embedded in it. Parliament could not ignore the act without undermining itself. The colonies could not disavow it without undermining years of resistance. Each side now faced internal audiences watching closely for signs of resolve or retreat. The harbor had been used before as a stage for protest, but never in this way. The water closed over the tea, but the meaning did not sink with it. It spread outward, carried by rumor, print, and reaction, transforming a local decision into a continental one. By choosing action over ambiguity, those involved ensured that the next response would not be symbolic. Authority, once challenged so openly, would answer in kind. The pause that followed did not feel like waiting anymore. It felt like the moment just before consequence arrived, when everyone knows something decisive is coming, but no one yet knows its exact shape. Punishment arrived dressed as correction. Parliament did not speak of revenge. It spoke of order, discipline, and necessity. The response to the destruction of the tea was framed as a measured effort to restore authority where it had been openly denied. Yet the measures chosen revealed how completely Britain now misunderstood the political terrain it was trying to control. The coercive acts, called the intolerable acts in the colonies, were not a single policy, but a sequence of constraints designed to isolate Massachusetts and force compliance. Boston's port was closed until damages were paid. The Massachusetts Charter was altered, sharply reducing local self-government. Royal officials accused of crimes could be tried outside the colony. Troops were quartered with expanded authority. Each provision addressed a specific concern. Together, they transformed governance into punishment. From Parliament's perspective, this approach made sense. The offense had been localized. Therefore, the response should be localized. Massachusetts had allowed disorder. Therefore, Massachusetts should bear consequence. This logic assumed the colonies still saw themselves as separate interests, capable of being divided and deterred by example. The colonies read the acts differently. What appeared in London as targeted discipline appeared in North America as precedent. If Parliament could suspend one colony's rights, it could suspend any. The issue ceased to be Boston's behavior and became everyone's vulnerability. Fear did what outrage alone had not. It unified. Daily life in Boston changed abruptly. Commerce slowed. Docks emptied. Workers lost income. Soldiers became more visible. Authority no longer felt theoretical or intermittent. It structured experience hour by hour. The city functioned under constraint, watched by the rest of the continent as a warning and a test. Outside Massachusetts, reaction accelerated. Supplies were sent. Meetings were called. Pamphlets reframed the crisis as collective rather than local. Sympathy turned into coordination. Colonies that had previously hesitated now faced a clearer choice: remain passive and risk isolation later, or engage while resistance still had momentum. Another historiographic debate centers here. Did Parliament intend to provoke unity, or did it simply misjudge colonial solidarity? Evidence strongly favors miscalculation. British policymakers believed pressure would fracture opposition by raising the cost of defiance. Instead, pressure clarified stakes and simplified decisions. Neutrality became harder to justify when rights appeared contingent. Colonial leaders responded with careful language. They still avoided calls for independence. Loyalty was reaffirmed even as obedience was questioned. This balancing act was deliberate. Resistance framed as defense of constitutional rights remained legitimate. Rebellion framed as rejection of monarchy did not, yet. What changed was scale. Opposition moved beyond protest into coordination of governance itself. Committees took on expanded roles. Local enforcement adapted to imperial withdrawal. Communities practiced self-regulation under stress. What had begun as resistance now functioned as rehearsal, testing whether collective action could replace imperial oversight if needed. In Britain, resolve hardened. Concession now appeared impossible without loss of authority. The axe had been passed. Enforcement had begun. To retreat would suggest that defiance worked, encouraging repetition. Parliament locked itself into a posture that required follow-through, even as consequences multiplied. The closing of Boston's port did not break resistance. It redistributed it. Economic pain spread across the colonies. Moral responsibility spread with it. Each act meant to isolate instead connected. Each effort to discipline clarified common interest. By the time the measures took effect, the question confronting colonial leaders was no longer whether Parliament had overreached, but how far collective response could go without becoming something openly revolutionary. That boundary, once theoretical, was now being approached in practice, step by deliberate step, as cooperation replaced complaint and preparation replaced protest. Coordination arrived before consensus. When colonial leaders gathered in the autumn of 1774, they did so without a flag, without a constitution, and without agreement on ultimate aims. What they shared was narrower and more urgent, a recognition that acting separately had become dangerous, and that speaking together, even imperfectly, was better than remaining silent alone. The First Continental Congress did not announce itself as a government. It insisted repeatedly that it was not one. Delegates spoke in the language of petition and grievance, not sovereignty. Loyalty to the crown was affirmed. Independence was not discussed as a goal. These denials were not disingenuous. They reflected genuine uncertainty. Many still believed reconciliation possible, provided pressure was applied collectively rather than chaotically. Yet the very act of gathering altered political reality. Colonies that had never before coordinated policy now did so deliberately. Delegates compared experiences, aligned arguments, and discovered how similar their concerns had become. Differences remained over strategy, over tone, over how far resistance should go. But the process of deliberation itself created a shared framework for decision-making. Britain underestimated this development. Officials tended to view colonial assemblies as local nuisances, easily managed in isolation. A continental body, even one that claimed no formal authority, disrupted that assumption. It suggested the colonies were capable of acting as a system, not just a collection of provinces. That capability mattered more than intent. Inside the Congress, restraint shaped debate. Proposals were weighed carefully, language edited repeatedly. The goal was legitimacy, not provocation. Economic pressure was chosen over violence. A renewed boycott was organized. Appeals were drafted to the King, to Parliament, to the British public, framing resistance as defense of constitutional rights rather than rejection of imperial order. At the same time, something quieter unfolded beneath the resolutions. Delegates returned home not just with agreements, but with expectations. Local committees expanded enforcement of boycotts. Communities practiced compliance with decisions made elsewhere. Authority, once dispersed, began to flow through shared channels. This was not a declaration of independence, but it functioned like a test run of collective governance. Another unresolved historical question sits here. Did the Congress create unity or merely reveal it? Some historians argue that common grievance already existed, and the Congress simply gave it structure. Others suggest that the act of coordination itself forged identity, turning parallel resistance into shared purpose. The evidence suggests a feedback loop. Grievance enabled coordination, and coordination deepened grievance into commitment. British leaders interpreted the Congress through familiar lenses. Petitions were read as complaints. Boycotts were seen as economic pressure that could be weathered. The absence of armed rebellion was taken as proof that authority still held. What was missed was how much the center of political gravity had shifted. Decisions affecting daily life were increasingly made locally, justified collectively, and enforced socially rather than imperially. Within the colonies, Uncertainty persisted. Not everyone supported the Congress. Loyalist voices remained strong in many regions. Even among supporters, there was anxiety about where coordination might lead. Collective action reduced vulnerability, but it also reduced the possibility of retreat. Once people began acting together, disengaging carried social cost. The Congress adjourned without fanfare. No victory was declared, no future announced. That understatement was intentional. Escalation was not yet desired, but neither was passivity. The resolutions passed required ongoing participation, sustained discipline, and willingness to accept consequence. These were not revolutionary qualities by design, but they resembled them in practice. As winter approached, communication slowed, but preparation did not stop. Militias drilled more openly. Supplies were inventoried. None of this was framed as rebellion. It was described as prudence, as readiness, as insurance against disorder. Language softened intention, but behavior edged closer to confrontation. In London, the petitions arrived amid political fatigue and frustration. Britain had faced colonial resistance before and outlasted it. There was confidence that firmness would again prevail. Parliament debated, but positions had hardened. Concession now looked less like compromise and more like surrender. By the time responses crossed the Atlantic, the situation had shifted again. Colonists had not waited. Coordination had already taken root. Authority was no longer something simply received or rejected. It was being practiced quietly in the space between imperial command and local necessity. Nothing in this moment declared inevitability outright. There was still no independence movement in name. There was still no war in law, but the machinery of collective action was now in place, turning slowly, steadily, and once assembled, difficult to dismantle without applying force. As the year closed, the colonies did not yet stand apart from the empire, but they no longer stood within it in the same way. They were learning to act together without asking permission first. And that lesson, once learned, tends to shape how the next crisis is met. Less with appeals, more with readiness. Preparation rarely announces itself as intent. In the months after the Congress adjourned, activity across the colonies increased without changing its official language. Nothing was called rebellion. Nothing was framed as war planning. What unfolded instead was a pattern of small, practical decisions about supplies, training, communication, that collectively moved society closer to violence while allowing everyone involved to claim they were still trying to avoid it. Arms and powder became objects of attention. Local committees took quiet inventories of what existed and what might be needed. Stores were relocated from vulnerable ports to inland towns. Purchases were made through intermediaries. Militias, long a part of colonial life, began to drill with more regularity and seriousness. These were not new institutions, but their purpose shifted subtly, from ceremonial readiness to functional preparedness. British officials noticed. Reports from governors grew more anxious. Words like uneasy, restless, and disorderly appeared more frequently. Yet interpretation lagged behind observation. London still tended to view militia activity as bluster, traditional posturing rather than genuine preparation. The assumption persisted that colonists lacked the discipline or unity to sustain armed resistance. Colonial leaders occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. They encouraged readiness while continuing to speak of reconciliation. This was not hypocrisy so much as contingency. They did not know which future would arrive, only that unpreparedness would be disastrous if events turned sharply. Preparedness could be justified as defense. Neglect could not. Another historical ambiguity sits here. Were colonial leaders already resigned to conflict, or did they believe preparation might deter it? Evidence suggests both motivations coexisted. Some hoped that visible readiness would force Britain to negotiate seriously. Others suspected that negotiation had already failed, and that preparation was the only remaining rational choice. The two positions did not require immediate resolution, which allowed cooperation to continue without consensus on ultimate aims. British commanders in North America faced their own constraints. Troops were limited in number. Supply lines stretched across the Atlantic. Orders arrived slowly and often contradicted local assessments. Generals were instructed to maintain order without provoking violence, a directive that grew harder to fulfill as civilian preparedness increased. Each confiscation risked confrontation. Each delay risked appearing weak. Information moved faster than authority. Riders carried news between towns. Committees relayed intelligence. Actions in one colony shaped responses in another. This network did not require central command. It functioned through shared expectation. When people believe they will be supported, they act more decisively. At the same time, loyalty fractured quietly. Families disagreed. Neighbors watched one another. Neutrality became harder to maintain as participation in preparation became visible. Choosing not to drill or contribute supplies began to signal position, whether intended or not. Social pressure filled gaps where formal authority receded. Britain still believed escalation could be managed. Parliament debated, reaffirmed resolve, and authorized stronger enforcement. Orders were issued to secure arms and suppress disorder. These directives assumed that decisive action could still reset conditions. What they underestimated was how deeply preparation had already altered psychology. Confiscation now felt like attack. Enforcement now felt like provocation. By early 1775, the situation rested on a narrowing margin. Both sides claimed restraint. Both sides prepared for what restraint might fail to prevent. Neither side fully controlled the pace anymore. Events were increasingly shaped by local encounters rather than distant intentions. The colonies did not yet declare independence. Britain did not yet declare war. But readiness had replaced trust as the organizing principle of political life. When societies begin arranging themselves around readiness rather than reconciliation, the future tends to arrive faster than anyone expects, often triggered by a moment that seems small until it carries consequences no one can undo. Misreading civilians is an old military error, and in the winter and early spring of 1775, British command repeated it with confidence. From a professional military perspective, the situation in Massachusetts still looked manageable. There were no organized armies, no declared rebellion, no unified command structure to confront. What appeared instead were civilians drilling part-time, storing supplies imperfectly, and arguing politics loudly. To trained officers, this resembled unrest, not war. General Thomas Gage, charged with maintaining order, operated under contradictory expectations. He was to enforce parliamentary authority while avoiding bloodshed. He was to suppress disorder without creating martyrs. He was to act decisively without appearing tyrannical. Each instruction limited the others. In practice, it left little room for error. British intelligence identified arms and powder as the material core of resistance. Remove them, and opposition would collapse back into rhetoric. This assumption rested on a familiar model. Civilians protest until force removes their means. Then compliance follows. What it failed to account for was how deeply preparation had already become social rather than merely material. Orders were issued to seize supplies stored in what were assumed to be lightly guarded locations. These were not framed as military operations, but as policing actions. The distinction mattered in British planning. Soldiers were told to move quietly, efficiently, and with restraint. Surprise, not confrontation, was expected to do the work. Colonial communities interpreted these movements differently. Rumors spread faster than troops marched. Riders carried warnings ahead of columns. Bells rang. Signals were agreed upon in advance. Preparedness, once abstract, became operational. People moved not because they were ordered to, but because they expected to be needed. Another question remains contested. Did British commanders underestimate colonial resolve, or did they overestimate their own ability to control escalation? Evidence suggests both. Reports downplayed resistance. Confidence in discipline bred optimism. What was missed was that resistance no longer depended on central coordination. It activated locally, reflexively. Militia forces were not professional soldiers, but they were not random crowds either. They drilled. They organized by town. They understood terrain. More importantly, they believed their cause was defensive. That belief shaped behavior. They were not preparing to conquer, but to block. That distinction would matter when confrontation finally came. British troops marched through countryside that looked peaceful but was already alert. Houses watched. Roads carried messages. Fields concealed movement. The environment itself functioned as part of the colonial response. Military maps did not capture this layer of readiness because it was social rather than geographic. Command decisions now carried immediate consequence. A march meant more than movement. It signaled intent. Each step towards confiscation was read as a step toward suppression. The longer troops advanced without turning back, the harder it became for either side to de-escalate without losing credibility. In London, debates continued as if time still stretched wide. Orders were written with deliberation. Responses were planned in months. On the ground, decisions compressed into hours. Authority lagged behind circumstance. And by the time intentions crossed the Atlantic, conditions had already shifted again. The miscalculation was not that civilians might resist, but that resistance would remain disorganized. British command assumed control could be reasserted with a limited show of force. What they encountered instead was a population that had already learned how to respond collectively without waiting for instructions. By early April, momentum no longer belonged to policy. It belonged to movement. Troops prepared to march. Communities prepared to answer. No one yet spoke of battle, but both sides were now arranging themselves in ways that made accidental collision far more likely than reconciliation, especially once soldiers and civilians began approaching the same objective from opposite directions, each convinced the other would yield first. By the spring of 1775, militia drilling no longer drew comment in many towns. It had settled into the background of ordinary life. Like market days or church bells, men gathered, practiced formations, learned signals, and dispersed again, returning to farms and shops with muskets leaned by doors rather than locked away. What once looked like preparation now felt like maintenance. This normalization mattered more than numbers. Militias were not standing armies, but they did not need to be. Their strength lay in familiarity. Familiarity with terrain, with one another, with the expectation of response. Training was uneven, discipline inconsistent, yet motivation was clear. These men believed they were protecting homes, not advancing ideology. Defense framed identity more powerfully than ambition ever could. Colonial leaders encouraged this posture carefully. Language remained cautious. Drilling was described as lawful, defensive, and prudent. Arms were justified as protection against disorder, not against the crown itself. This framing allowed participation without pushing individuals to declare revolutionary intent. People could prepare without admitting where preparation might lead. British observers struggled to interpret what they saw. Reports acknowledged increased militia activity, but often dismissed it as theatrical. Civilian soldiers, drilling part-time, did not fit traditional models of military threat. Professional officers assumed discipline would falter under pressure. What they underestimated was not skill, but commitment. People defending familiar ground behave differently from those enforcing distant authority. Another historical uncertainty surfaces here. Were militias effective because of training or because of expectation? Evidence suggests expectation mattered more. Communities believed response would be collective. That belief created speed. When alarms sounded, movement followed almost automatically. No orders were required because readiness had been rehearsed socially as much as tactically. Supply storage reflected the same logic. Powder and shot were dispersed rather than centralized. Vulnerability was reduced by diffusion. Confiscation became harder because there was no single target. This adaptation did not require sophisticated planning, only shared understanding. British strategy, oriented towards seizure and control, struggled to respond to an opponent that refused concentration. Everyday routines absorbed these changes quietly. A man might drill in the morning and plow fields in the afternoon. Children watched and learned without instruction. Communities grew accustomed to the presence of arms without treating them as extraordinary. When readiness blends into routine, escalation becomes less startling when it finally arrives. British commanders, sensing momentum slipping, faced narrowing options. Further delay risked emboldening resistance. Action risked provoking violence. Orders to secure arms grew more urgent. The assumption remained that once supplies were removed, resistance would dissipate. What was not fully appreciated was how much resistance now lived in habit rather than hardware. Communication continued to favor the colonies. Signals, messengers, and informal networks transmitted information faster than formal dispatches. This asymmetry did not require superiority in intelligence, only proximity and motivation. British movements were observed, interpreted, and relayed almost as soon as they began. As April approached, the environment itself seemed to lean toward collision. Roads were known, routes were anticipated, meeting points were understood. None of this required a central command issuing directives. It emerged from repetition and shared expectation. Preparedness had reached a point where response no longer depended on decision. It depended on recognition. At this stage, Inevitability did not feel dramatic. It felt procedural. If troops moved, militias would respond. If arms were seized, communities would resist. These outcomes were not debated so much as assumed. Once behavior becomes assumed, restraint requires active intervention rather than passive hope. The colonies had not chosen war. Britain had not declared it. Yet both sides had arranged themselves around the possibility so thoroughly that avoidance would now require deliberate reversal. And reversals are rare when people believe they are already acting in defense of something essential, especially when readiness itself has become part of who they are. When British troops set out toward the Massachusetts countryside, their orders were specific, but their environment was not. Secrecy was intended. Surprise was expected. What unfolded instead was a collision between intention and preparedness, where neither side fully controlled what came next. The march toward Lexington was framed as a limited operation. Supplies were to be seized. Resistance, if encountered, was to be avoided. The goal was not battle, but enforcement. British commanders believed discipline and restraint would keep events contained. What they did not fully account for was how many people were already watching, waiting, and interpreting movement as meaning. Alarms spread ahead of the column. Riders moved faster than soldiers. Church bells rang not for worship, but for warning. Militia members gathered because gathering had become routine. There was no single order to assemble, only recognition of a familiar signal. Readiness activated itself. At Lexington Green, opposing expectations met. British troops advanced. Militia formed. Words were exchanged, though later accounts disagreed sharply on who said what. Some witnesses recalled commands to disperse. Others remembered warnings not to fire. Memory fractured almost immediately, shaped by fear and allegiance. Then a shot was fired. No one could later agree by whom or why. That uncertainty remains one of the most persistent questions in American history. Was it accidental? Deliberate? A misinterpreted signal? The evidence refuses a single answer. What matters is that once the sound echoed, restraint collapsed. British soldiers fired volleys. Militia scattered. Some fell. Others ran. In moments, the confrontation ended, but its significance did not. Violence had occurred between imperial troops and colonial civilians organized for defense. The line that had been approached for years was now crossed, not by declaration, but by reaction. From a military perspective, the engagement was small. From a political perspective, it was transformative. The ambiguity surrounding the first shot ensured that blame could be assigned wherever interpretation already pointed. Each side emerged convinced the other had forced the issue. Colonial communities absorbed the news rapidly. Reports spread, often incomplete, sometimes exaggerated. What mattered was confirmation that force had been used. Preparedness shifted into response. Militias that had assembled as precaution now moved with purpose. British commanders still believed the situation could be controlled. The mission continued toward Concord. The assumption remained that resistance would fade once initial shock passed. That assumption would not survive the next phase. Lexington did not look like war in the traditional sense. There were no declarations, no formal lines, no victory claimed. Yet, it altered perception irreversibly. Authority was no longer abstract. Resistance was no longer hypothetical. Both had now acted with weapons. The confusion surrounding that morning did not delay escalation. It ensured it. Because no one could agree on how it began. No one could agree on how to stop it. Each side retreated into its own certainty, carrying with it the memory of shots fired and blood spilled, however briefly, on ground that had once felt familiar. What followed would move faster than deliberation, shaped less by policy than by reaction, as events outran intentions and left little space for anyone to pause long enough to recover the assumptions that had already been lost. After the brief clash at Lexington, British troops pressed on toward Concord, still operating under orders that assumed authority could be reasserted through completion of the mission. Supplies remained the objective. Withdrawal was not yet considered failure. What had changed, though few fully grasped it at the time, was that movement itself had become vulnerable. At Concord, the situation repeated with variation rather than resolution. British units searched for stores that had already been moved. Bridges were approached cautiously. Militia gathered again, this time in greater numbers and with sharper expectation. Shots were exchanged near the North Bridge. British soldiers fell. Colonial forces did not scatter as they had at Lexington. They advanced, then held. This moment mattered less for its casualties than for its psychology. British troops encountered organized resistance that did not dissolve under pressure. Colonial forces, in turn, discovered that they could stand, fire, and remain. The belief that militia would always yield under professional discipline weakened on both sides. Once the mission objectives proved unattainable, withdrawal became necessary. That withdrawal unfolded not as a march, but as a running confrontation. Militia units moved along familiar roads, using walls, trees, and terrain to harass the column. Engagements flared and faded unpredictably. British formations struggled to maintain cohesion over distance. This was not planned warfare. It was reactive, improvised, and shaped by geography. Local knowledge functioned as force multiplier. Militia did not need to defeat the column outright. They needed only to apply pressure continuously. Fatigue accumulated. Ammunition dwindled. Morale strained. British commanders still believed reinforcement would stabilize the situation. Relief forces eventually arrived, preventing disaster. Yet, by the time the column reached safety, something decisive had already occurred. The retreat had transformed a limited enforcement action into a running demonstration that imperial troops could be challenged across open countryside. News traveled outward with speed and distortion. Reports emphasized resistance, casualties, and movement. Each retelling simplified complexity into narrative. Colonists heard confirmation that armed response worked. British officials heard confirmation that authority was slipping beyond easy repair. Another unresolved question continues to shape interpretation. Was Concord the moment war truly began, or merely the moment its inevitability became undeniable? Some historians emphasize Lexington as symbolic ignition. Others point to Concord as practical transformation. In truth, the two function together, one breaking restraint, the other breaking illusion. By evening, militia units did not disperse as they might have weeks earlier. They regrouped, camps formed, supplies were gathered, communication intensified. What had been readiness became sustained posture. The countryside reorganized itself around resistance without formal instruction. British authority did not collapse that day. Troops remained. Governance continued where possible. Yet confidence was damaged in a way that could not be repaired through explanation or limited concession. Force had been met with force. Withdrawal had been contested. The image of control no longer matched experience on the ground. The road back from Concord did more than exhaust soldiers. It redrew expectations. Colonial communities had crossed from defense to engagement. British command had crossed from enforcement to containment. Neither side had chosen this shift explicitly, but both now had to operate within it. As night settled, the countryside quieted, but not into normalcy. Men slept where they stood. Messages traveled by firelight. The assumption that tomorrow might restore yesterday no longer held. Movement had replaced debate, and once movement sets direction, it tends to carry events forward faster than anyone intended. After Concord, events no longer waited for permission. News spread through riders, rumor, and assumption, each version sharpening urgency. By the time official orders arrived, communities had already acted on what they believed had happened, not on what governors hoped to clarify. This acceleration exposed a structural weakness Britain had long managed but never solved. Distance. Decisions made in London required weeks to arrive. Revisions required weeks more. In a crisis defined by hours, this lag turned governance into reaction rather than control. Colonial coordination, by contrast, thrived on proximity. Towns responded to neighboring towns. Colonies watched one another closely and adjusted without waiting for confirmation. British commanders attempted to reassert tempo. Troops consolidated positions. Supplies were secured where possible. Reinforcements were requested. The assumption remained that firmness, once re-established, would halt further escalation. Yet firmness required coherence, and coherence required communication that could not keep pace with unfolding reality. Colonial leaders faced a different problem. They had not authorized war, yet warlike conditions were spreading. Militias assembled beyond initial intentions. Volunteers arrived without orders. Camps expanded. Managing enthusiasm became as important as directing resistance. Authority within the colonies shifted again, now toward those who could coordinate movement rather than merely argue principle. Another question troubles historians here. Did escalation occur because leaders failed to restrain events, or because restraint had become impossible once force was used? Evidence suggests that once shots were fired and contested, withdrawal occurred. Expectations changed faster than policy could adapt. People prepared for what they believed was coming, and belief itself became causal. The Second Continental Congress had not yet convened, yet decisions were already being made that would later appear to belong to it. Local committees organized defense. Supplies were requisitioned. Training intensified. None of this required centralized approval. It functioned through shared interpretation of risk. British policy struggled to respond coherently. Some officials urged conciliation. Others urged decisive force. Mixed signals crossed the Atlantic, creating confusion on the ground. Commanders acted on partial guidance, often improvising. Each action, however limited in intent, was interpreted by colonial communities as confirmation that conflict was widening. The king's ministers still believed reconciliation possible. Petitions were read. Debates continued, but each day without de-escalation made reconciliation more abstract. Colonists no longer measured British intent by words, but by movement. Troops remained. Fortifications expanded. Authority appeared entrenched. Meanwhile, loyalty continued to fracture quietly. Some colonists remained committed to the crown and feared disorder more than domination. Others, previously undecided, felt compelled to choose as violence reshaped daily life. Neutrality required staying still while everything else moved, and staying still became increasingly conspicuous. This phase did not produce dramatic proclamations. It produced alignment. Communities aligned with expectation. Leaders aligned with necessity. Even those who still hoped for peace began organizing for endurance rather than persuasion. The future was no longer imagined as a return to the past, but as something that would have to be managed through sustained effort. By the time formal responses began to arrive from Britain, the situation they addressed no longer existed. Conditions had shifted again. Positions had hardened. Preparations had expanded. Authority, once delayed, now found itself perpetually behind. When communication fails to synchronize intention with reality, power loses its ability to steer events. After Concord, that failure became persistent. The empire could still command, but it could not coordinate fast enough to prevent others from shaping outcomes first. From that point forward, decisions would be made where events occurred, not where authority resided. And that inversion would carry consequences long before anyone officially named them. After the fighting spread, loyalty became less about declarations and more about behavior. Who drilled? Who supplied? Who spoke cautiously? Who stayed silent? These choices, once private, now carried weight because conflict had moved into daily routine rather than remaining an abstract possibility. Families felt this shift first. Differences that could once be argued at tables or ignored in public now demanded position. A brother joined the militia. A father warned against disorder. A neighbor offered shelter to soldiers. None of these acts required speeches. Yet, each signaled alignment. The revolution, still unnamed, entered households through implication rather than announcement. Communities responded unevenly. In some towns, resistance dominated quickly, reinforced by shared experience and proximity to violence. In others, loyalty to Britain remained strong, supported by economic ties, cultural attachment, or simple fear of instability. What changed was not the existence of disagreement, but the tolerance for ambiguity. As preparation and participation became visible, refusing to choose began to look like choosing. British officials struggled to interpret this fragmentation. They had long assumed loyalty was the default condition, disrupted temporarily by agitators. What they encountered instead was a spectrum of positions, each shaped by local context. Enforcement aimed at suppressing resistance often intensified division rather than resolving it, pushing undecided individuals toward commitment. Colonial leaders recognized the danger of internal fracture. Unity was fragile. Too much pressure risked alienating those still hesitant. Too little risked losing momentum. Appeals emphasized shared grievance rather than ideology, common rights rather than future visions. The goal was cohesion without coercion, a balance difficult to maintain as circumstances hardened. Historians continue to debate whether the collapse of neutrality made conflict inevitable. Some argue that once communities polarized, compromise became socially impossible even if politically conceivable. Others suggest that polarization followed violence rather than causing it. What is clear is that violence altered social cost. Alignment now offered protection. Neutrality offered exposure. Economic life reflected this change. Trade routes shifted, boycotts intensified, supplies flowed along political lines. Participation in resistance reshaped markets as well as morals. Choosing sides affected livelihoods, not just beliefs. That material consequence anchored political identity more firmly than argument ever could. British authority still functioned in pockets. Courts operated where possible. Officials issued proclamations. Yet, enforcement depended increasingly on force rather than acceptance. When authority relies on presence rather than consent, it demands resources that grow harder to supply as resistance spreads. Within the colonies, governance adapted organically. Committees filled gaps left by withdrawn or distrusted officials. Order was maintained locally, often with surprising effectiveness. This did not yet constitute a new state, but it demonstrated that communities could regulate themselves under pressure. The experience mattered. Confidence grows through practice. By the time neutrality collapsed as a viable stance, the social terrain had changed decisively. Conflict was no longer just between empire and colonies. It ran through towns, churches, and families. The cost of reversal rose accordingly. Any attempt at reconciliation now faced not only political obstacles, but social ones, embedded in relationships already strained by choice and consequence. As people adjusted to this new reality, the question shifted again. It was no longer whether disagreement could be resolved, but whether coexistence under the old structure remained possible without continuous force. That question did not require an answer immediately. It lingered, shaping behavior, narrowing patience, and preparing minds for developments that would soon demand clarity where ambiguity had once been enough. Authority often collapses last in imagination. Even as conditions on the ground deteriorated, even as armed camps formed and loyalty fractured, Britain's leadership still believed firmness could restore obedience. This belief was not stubbornness alone. It was rooted in precedent. Empires had weathered unrest before. Colonies had protested before. Order, history suggested, reasserted itself once resistance met resolve. King George III's position reflected this confidence. He did not see himself presiding over a dying relationship, but managing a dangerous one. Reports reaching London emphasized disorder, lawlessness, and intimidation. Colonial grievances were framed as exaggerated or manipulated by a minority. The solution from this perspective was clarity, authority stated plainly, backed by force if necessary. In August 1775, the Proclamation of Rebellion formalized this view. It declared that resistance in the colonies had moved beyond legitimate protest into open defiance. The document was meant to draw a line, to isolate opposition, and to reassure loyal subjects that the Crown would act decisively. It was not a declaration of war, but it functioned as a closing argument against reconciliation as previously imagined. Colonial reaction was swift and telling. The proclamation did not shock so much as confirm. For months, many had suspected that Britain no longer distinguished between protest and rebellion. Hearing it stated officially clarified uncertainty. Those who still hoped firmness might be temporary now faced language that left little room for reinterpretation. Historians debate whether this proclamation made war inevitable or merely acknowledged reality. Some argue that by labeling resistance as rebellion, Britain foreclosed compromise. Others suggest that compromise had already failed. and the proclamation simply recognized that fact. What is clear is that the declaration hardened perceptions on both sides simultaneously. British ministers continued to believe that decisive military action would end resistance quickly. The colonies lacked professional armies, heavy artillery, and centralized command. Loyalty, they assumed, would reassert itself once resistance proved costly. This assessment underestimated endurance. It also misunderstood motivation. Colonists were no longer calculating risk in abstract terms. They were responding to lived experience. Within the colonies, the proclamation accelerated a shift already underway. Loyalty to the crown became harder to reconcile with participation in defense. Language adjusted accordingly. Appeals to royal protection faded. Appeals to collective security grew louder. The idea that the king might intervene on behalf of colonial rights lost credibility. Yet even now, independence was not universally embraced. Many still hesitated to imagine a future without the empire. What changed was feasibility. The crown had defined opposition as rebellion. Once defined that way, maintaining allegiance while resisting policy became logically unstable. People adjusted, not because ideology demanded it, but because circumstances did. British authority, in declaring rebellion, clarified its own limits. It acknowledged that governance through consent had failed in practice, even if it claimed the right to enforce obedience. This admission carried unintended consequences. If obedience required force, then legitimacy depended on success. Failure would not simply be inconvenient, it would be transformative. As the proclamation circulated, it did not halt resistance. It reorganized it. Opposition no longer needed to justify itself as loyal protest. It could justify itself as necessary defense. The difference mattered psychologically. Defense invites endurance. Protest invites patience. One can last longer than the other. The king still believed time favored authority. He expected resistance to fracture under pressure. What he did not see was how much time had already been spent teaching the colonies how to coordinate, endure, and respond without waiting for permission. Those lessons did not dissolve when authority spoke more loudly. By the end of 1775, Britain had named the conflict without resolving it. The colonies had not yet named independence, but they had absorbed the implication that reconciliation, as once understood, was no longer on offer. The space between protest and revolution narrowed further, not because either side rushed forward, but because the language of authority had removed the middle ground on which retreat once seemed possible. By late 1775, armed encounters had spread beyond Massachusetts, not as coordinated campaigns, but as extensions of expectation. Communities now assumed conflict might reach them. That assumption shaped behavior faster than any official directive could. Men drilled, supplies moved, roads were watched. What had begun as response hardened into posture. Skirmishes flared along contested edges, ports, frontiers, supply routes. None resembled formal war, as European officers understood it. There were no declarations, no uniforms defining sides cleanly, no clear front lines. Yet violence repeated often enough to feel structural rather than accidental. Each encounter confirmed what earlier ones had implied. Restraint was no longer reliable. British command attempted to impose coherence. Fortifications were strengthened. Garrisons reinforced. Strategic points secured. These actions were defensive in design, but they appeared offensive in effect. Presence itself became provocation. Every reinforcement suggested permanence. Every fort suggested occupation. Colonists interpreted preparation as intention. At the same time, colonial forces began to coordinate beyond immediate locality. The Second Continental Congress assumed responsibilities it had not initially claimed. Command structures were discussed. Supplies pooled. Authority shifted again, this time toward bodies capable of sustaining conflict rather than merely reacting to it. None of this required independence to be declared. It required only acknowledgement that fighting was ongoing. Another historical question shadows this stage. Did war begin because leaders chose it, or because circumstances removed alternatives? Evidence leans toward the latter. Once armed resistance spread and authority responded with force, the option of disengagement shrank rapidly. Standing down would now require unilateral vulnerability, something neither side could accept. British policymakers continued to describe the conflict as containment rather than war. This framing mattered domestically, but it did little on the ground. Soldiers acted under combat conditions regardless of terminology. Colonists responded as people under threat, not as petitioners awaiting reply. Language lagged behind reality. Loyalist communities faced increasing pressure. British protection could not reach everywhere. Choosing allegiance now carried risk. Some fled. Others adapted quietly. Many found themselves caught between forces, neither of which could guarantee safety. This instability further eroded the social fabric that reconciliation would have required. The colonies, meanwhile, learned through repetition. Coordination improved. Mistakes were corrected. Experience accumulated. What had once felt like improvisation began to resemble method. This did not yet guarantee success, but it made retreat harder to justify. People invested effort. Effort creates commitment. By this stage, inevitability no longer felt theoretical. It felt logistical. Supplies were needed. Leadership was required. Discipline mattered. Questions once framed as political now demanded operational answers. When conflicts reach that point, resolution tends to follow force rather than persuasion. Britain still hoped decisive action would end resistance before it solidified fully. The colonies still hesitated to articulate final aims. Yet between those positions, fighting continued. The absence of formal declaration did not slow it. If anything, it accelerated it, because ambiguity allowed each side to claim it was acting defensively. As winter deepened, camps endured. Men stayed armed. Communities reorganized around risk. The machinery of conflict turned without ceremony, driven by necessity rather than ideology. What remained unresolved was not whether war existed, but how long it could continue without being named, and what would happen once naming it became unavoidable. By the time winter gave way to the early months of 1776, the question confronting the colonies was no longer whether conflict could be avoided, but whether it could be endured without clarity. Fighting existed. Authority had fractured. Coordination had emerged. What remained uncertain was how to name what had already taken shape. British power still mattered, but it no longer organized reality on the ground. Orders arrived late. Enforcement required force. Loyalty had become conditional and uneven. The empire's reach persisted, yet its grip depended increasingly on presence rather than acceptance. This shift altered calculation on both sides. Authority that must be imposed continuously loses flexibility, because withdrawal looks like defeat, and advance looks like escalation. In the colonies, collective action no longer required justification. It required management. Supplies had to be gathered, command structures refined, discipline enforced. These tasks did not wait for ideological resolution. They arose from necessity. People who still spoke cautiously about ultimate aims acted daily as if separation were already underway, not because they had chosen it philosophically, but because circumstances demanded autonomy in practice. Historians often ask when the American Revolution truly began. Some point to ideas, others to violence, others to declarations. Yet, inevitability rarely aligns with milestones. It emerges when reversal becomes more costly than continuation. By early 1776, reversing course would have required dismantling organizations, disarming communities, re-establishing trust, and persuading people to forget experiences that had already reshaped expectation. None of that seemed plausible. British leaders still hoped decisive victory could restore obedience. Colonial leaders still hesitated to articulate independence. Between those positions, reality advanced. War did not need to be declared to exist. It needed only to be sustained. And sustainment was already underway. The final illusion to fall was the belief that naming the conflict would cause it. In truth, naming lagged behind action. The Declaration of Independence would soon provide language for what had already occurred, not initiate it. By the time words were written, the relationship they described had already collapsed under the weight of incompatible authority, mutual mistrust, and repeated resort to force. This is the moment inevitability becomes visible in retrospect, not because everyone agreed on the future, but because no one could credibly return to the past. The empire and the colonies had crossed too many thresholds: legal, social, military, psychological, to pretend that adjustment alone could repair the breach. What began as dispute over governance had become a contest over who would govern at all. What began as resistance, framed as loyalty, had become defense, framed as necessity. These transformations did not occur overnight. They accumulated through repetition, reaction, and adaptation, until momentum itself replaced choice. By 1775, peace was already impossible, not because war was desired, but because the structures that had once contained disagreement no longer functioned. Authority could not persuade. Resistance could not retreat. Both sides moved forward because standing still had ceased to be an option. The American Revolution did not begin with a declaration. It began when inevitability replaced negotiation as the organizing principle of events. Everything that followed, the words, the battles, the nation, grew out of that substitution, made quietly, gradually, and long before anyone formally admitted it had been made.